Hey everybody, this is Alex Merced from alexmercedcoder.com, and I just wanted to kind of elaborate. I did a video where I kind of first started my thoughts on these ideas. This is where I talk about, like, how. Well, let's just start from the beginning. So basically, what I want to kind of emphasize here is sort of the difference between your old school function syntax. So basically, this like function myfunc console.log hello. So that's the sort of old school function syntax. And then the new school function syntax, aka IRO functions, is like this, would be constant myfunc2 equals console.log hello. Now, for the longest time, it just seemed like it was made just to make the amount of characters you type a little bit smaller. I mean, when you look at it, you don't save that much in the way of characters, depending on what you're doing. But as I explore the functionality of it more, the more a couple things become apparent. Okay, it's kind of like archaeological digging into a language, in the sense that I learned JavaScript later on. Like, literally, I didn't really get deep into JavaScript until 2019. So there's all this rich history in JavaScript as far as how the language evolved, because it was a very democratic process. Okay, other languages generally have like somebody who is the creator of the language, so there's a way to do things. But JavaScript is very interesting because, I mean, while it was created in 10 days for the Netscape Navigator browser, it was, at the end of the day, really a spec. I mean, the Netscape version was a version, but then Microsoft created their own version of the same language and called it something else. And then, Adobe did the same thing with ActionScript, which really was like a tossed-away version of the standard. And there's all these different versions of JavaScript because of the browser wars. Everyone kind of implemented it differently. And then as everyone decided, hey, this is kind of chaotic, we need to kind of really stick to a standard and kind of make it work between all the browsers. Well, what happened is a lot of people are like, yeah, fine, we'll adopt your version of doing things, but we need our way of doing things to work too. So you ended up with, all this sorts of weird flexibility and multiple ways of doing things. That's kind of unique to JavaScript because it was a very democratic process to get to where it is today, where basically there was a lot of different people, a lot of different actors in different places that made decisions that affected the resulting JavaScript. And then to take it even further, then there was just a lot of advancement saying, hey, you know what? There's a lot of more modern languages that have figured out better ways of doing things. There are patterns that don't exist in this that we like in older languages that are just more what people expect in a programming language, so they added those. And this is kind of an example of one where before this existed, so like this didn't exist yet, let's say. So you had to make your functions like this. And before the class keyword existed in JavaScript, basically this served two roles. Okay, with it, you can make a function, so basically make a thing that tells you can call upon a bundle of code whenever you want, but it also doubled as an object constructor. So I could do this. I could be like, hey, this dot name equals Alex, this dot age equals 34, and then go down here and say const Alex equals a new myfunc, and then console.log Alex. And that would work to create a new object. So like if I run this, node, see, it created a object of type myfunc with those properties. Okay, but that's confusing. Okay, in most languages, generally, your mechanism for constructing objects or constructing abstractions is in classes, and functions are functions, and you don't have this like weird syntax that does both. So I can see why they wanted to kind of evolve from this. So in this case, they separated the actual function part to this. So this I cannot use as a constructor. So if I were to copy this over and put it inside an arrow function, this won't work because arrow functions do not do double work. Arrow functions are purely just functions as a value. So I can pass this value that is the function, that is the set of instructions, anywhere I want. But I know it does one thing. It acts as a function. And that makes it a lot clearer as far as when I read other people's code, what does this syntax do? I know it's always a function. While with this, I have to kind of read carefully because they could be trying to use it to construct objects or using it as a function. My func2. So let's save it and run it and get the error. See, my func2 is not a constructor. Cool. So let's just control Z all this, get back to where we were before. I mean, the only other bigger difference, or other big difference between arrow functions and whatnot is also the inclusion of the arguments object. So I could just be like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Oh wait, those are. Let's just console.log arguments. And then if I were to run this and pass in a whole bunch of arguments, you'll get this weird object that contains all these objects. So if I hit save and I run it, see, arguments. You get this arguments object inside the old school function because just the way it's designed. So again, it's just like really confusing because you have this arguments object that's not, you wouldn't know it's there unless you know it's there. And then it also acts as a constructor, which you wouldn't know unless you know. The only obvious thing is that you could create functions because of the function keyword. Now, back to the arrow function. The arrow function does not have the arguments object. So if I pass a bunch of arguments and then try to console log the arguments object, it's going to shoot me an error or give me undefined. Oh, still saying new, so let's just do this. Because it's purely a function, so I got to invoke it like a function. See, so it says hello, but again, it runs undefined when I try to console log arguments because there is no arguments object in an arrow function. Because it doesn't act as like a constructor like my func. So that's just, those are interesting points. So does that mean what the arguments object used to be used for is essentially what in other languages is referred to as a variadic function. It's a function that takes a variable number of arguments. Although this could be as easily done by just passing in an array with as many elements as you want, and you achieve the same effect, which honestly makes more sense. It's more explicit, more obvious, and that allows you to take in other parameters for other things. So I just don't see it as a necessity. And I think the way it is now is clearer. It makes for clearer code, which I like. Cool. So that's sort of the first part of this video. That's what I wanted to explain. Just kind of like, okay, what is the difference between this and this fundamentally, like functionally, like practically? Well, one syntax is, you know, you hear like, oh yeah, I always use arrow functions, or arrow functions are awesome. What is it that they fundamentally do different? Why is it such a big deal? What came before? So then if I want to create constructors, so if I wanted to use this as a constructor going forward, if I wanted to use, and I'm using arrow functions to do functions, then technically that's when they brought in the class keyword. So instead I would do class myfunc, and then I would just make the constructor function inside the class. And then there you go. Okay. And then let me change this back to my func. And now let's experiment. This is something I actually have not tried out yet to see if the arguments object still exists within a class constructor. Because essentially what changed is we took out that constructor aspect from functions when we made arrow functions. So does that mean that the arguments object came along with it? Let's find out. Ensure my func cannot be invoked without new. Oh, I gotta throw in the new keyword because creating object constructors have to be invoked with new. And yes, the arguments object still exist within classes. Okay, so that basically this arguments object is something that's a class thing. It's an object creation constructor thing. that's where it exists. So once we took out the constructor from functions, it took out the arguments object with it too. Thus, and also the use of the this keyword, because this is only useful if you're creating an object. So once you appreciate that, this becomes a whole lot clearer what they were doing here. They were making a clear distinction to make for cleaner code, making object construction a class, which is a much more familiar abstraction, and saying functions are functions, and making arrow functions, so that way they're purely just arrow functions, and you're not confusing one syntax that's trying to do all things. Okay, so that's my first point, and I think it's a point that a lot of people are always wondering, like, what's the big difference between ES5 functions and ES6 functions and classes and all this stuff? Now you hopefully you have a clear idea of the distinction. But once I realized this, I started thinking, well, ES5 functions, I would be able to pass those anywhere I want. I could pass them as arguments into a function. I could pass those as make an array of functions. So couldn't I theoretically make an array of constructors? Okay, with F functions, something like this. So let's do that. So let's say const my consts for my constructors, okay, equals, and this time we're going to make it an array. The first value is going to be a class. Oh, actually, no, we're not going to do classes yet. We'll come back to that. First, we're going to do it the old school way. So function, and since I'm passing it into an array, I don't have to give it a name. And we just say this dot name equals Alex. Okay, so I just passed this function that works as a constructor into an array. And now let's try this. Const Alex equals a new my const. I'm taking the array, using the first element of the array, which is the class, and then invoking it. So not typically the way you would see yourself constructing new objects, but let's give it a shot. Okay. Oh, I have to console log it. Okay, console.log Alex. And see, it works. I am able to construct an object using that constructor function. So does that mean I can pass in a class there as well? Let's try that. What if I replace this with class? Because essentially it's the same thing. A constructor function is the same thing as a class. They're literally the same thing. So constructor. Well, let me put the thingies. So now I'm passing in the class into the array. Let me save it. So I'm passing this class into the array, and it's in the same place. It's the first element of the array. So if I save it, let's see if that works. Cool. Okay. So that's neat. Next, let's try passing it as an object property. Okay, so we'll create an object, and we're going to have a property called Alex, and that property is going to equal a function. We'll do it as a constructor function. So this dot name equals Alex. And let's see here. So now it's no longer an array, so it wouldn't be myConst0. It would be myConst.Alex, because myConst is now an object. So I'm just saying, hey, new myConst.Alex should still do the same thing. It's a function being formed as a constructor. It's being invoked with new. It's just a value. Ta-da! Okay, and that time it has a name because the constructor actually is named this time. Okay, so really what's all that's showing here. So usually you think of this as the class name, but really what it is, it's the name of the constructor that constructed the object. Okay? So you know what constructor it came from. I don't know. I just find this stuff very, very interesting. And actually, let me make this font a little bit bigger. There we go. Let's continue on. Now let's do the same thing with a class. So instead, I'll change this again to a class. Get rid of this. We need to bring in the constructor function for the class. Constructor. Let's get rid of that semicolon. It really doesn't matter if that semicolon's there. Let me save. Okay, and there we go. So basically I'm passing in a class as the value of the key. But again, a class is really just a constructor function, as we did before, so it should still just work. It's a value. And again, this just was mind-blowing to me, not because it's a huge thing. I just never really thought of passing as classes as values. And then so once I realized that the functions could do that, functions were constructors. I don't know. Once you see it, it just becomes very clear. And I find that stuff super interesting. So see, it still works. Now, so basically what we've done so far is we've passed a function in a class into an array and invoked it. We've passed a class and a constructor function into an object and called it. Well, let's see here. Other fun ways we can do this. Let's try to return it as return it from another function. Okay, let's do that. So let's have fun with this. So I'm going to make an arrow function. Okay, and all this thing does is return, and it's going to return a function. So we're going to return a function, parentheses, and again this dot name equals Alex. So let's think about that for a second. Okay, it's going to return the function. So in that case, now we invoke the original function, which is myConst, and then we have to invoke the function that it returns. This one we might have to play with syntactically, but let's see. I think this is correct. Okay, so basically what's happening is that this first invocation is invoking the myConst function, which returns the function that's a constructor, which then is invoked by that parentheses. myConst is not a constructor. Got it. Okay, so then in that case, for this, just because the first thing is a function, I would have to do this. So first I would have to do this, say that the class is or the constructor function gets saved into Alex, and then actually let's do this. Let Alex, so I can reassign it, and let Alex equal Alex. Okay, because now Alex has that constructor function inside of it, because that's what this returns. I'm not going to invoke it right away. So this creates the constructor function, which gets stored into Alex, and then I call upon it, and actually I need the new keyword, and then we'll console log Alex. Should take me to the same place. Identifier Alex has already been declared. Got it. Okay, so then I just need to do Alex2. Save. See, you're discovering with me. This is good times. Okay, cool. Node function. Oh, I console logged Alex2. Save. And there you go. We constructed an object. Okay, that isn't... I mean, if you were to dynamically create classes, this could be a fun way to do it. And again, I could just do this as a class too. So let's try that. Class. Because they're the same thing. Again, that's the point I'm trying to get across. That old school ES5 functions and constructors are the same thing. So any one thing one can do, the other one can do as well. Okay, but this has got to be inside a constructor. There we go. So again, this is going to initiate the class. The class gets passed into Alex. The class then gets instantiated to Alex2, and then we console log Alex2. So this should work. And it does. Okay, so that's pretty fun. Okay, it kind of opens up a lot of new possibilities as far as creating object constructors. I mean, you could have already done it with the old school functions, but again, classes I think are just semantically easier to understand intention of the code, which to me matters. That someone reads your code and they kind of see why you're doing what you're doing, versus sort of creating constructors through the old school functions. And this is different than creating factory functions. I'm still creating objects from a constructor. That's different than necessarily just creating new objects, creating a function that creates objects, not via a constructor. So if this were a factory function, it would be more like, I wouldn't even need the new keyword. It would be more like this. So if I want to do this as or at least the way I think of a factory function, a factory function could really just be anything that constructs. So for all intents and purposes, these could be factory functions. But in this case, if instead, it would just return a new object with the property name equals Alex. Okay, I end up kind of pretty much with the same result. But again, I'm not using a function that constructs the object through that other process. Okay. Oh yeah, that's right. I'm still console logging Alex too. Save. So there are a lot of ways to construct objects, which we discussed in the video I made like right before this one. But there's a very interesting distinction between the ES5 syntax and the ES6 arrow functions that once you understand it, I feel like it enables you a lot as far as how can you use a language, how can you really manipulate the data to get the results that you want. And then when you throw in all that stuff like spread operators and all the other fun syntactical things that have been added into REST operators, spread operators, destructuring and whatnot, you end up really having some really cool, exciting stuff you can do here. And just making me more and more of a fan of JavaScript. So hopefully you guys enjoyed that. My name is Alex Merced from alexmercedcoder.com. Have a great day and enjoy.